For over a decade, the Chinese Communist Party has been butchering thousands of prisoners of conscience for their organs, one of the most horrific genocides in modern history. Doctors schedule an exact day that foreign patients get an organ, whereas in the US, it usually takes around 2 years to find a match. How could one of the greatest crimes of the 21st century happen in one of the largest countries in the world? To understand that, we need to understand some of the history of the Chinese Communist Party. Anastasia, you grew up under the Chinese Communist Party. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, I did. And when I talk to my father's generation these days, I can still feel the fear, the trauma that they experienced. Cultural Revolution is a big tragedy in Chinese history. Communist Party aimed to destroy Chinese traditional culture. What they destroyed was basic human nature, was the way that our society was formed, the foundation of our society, the kindness between people. And my father's generation grew up in the midst of Cultural Revolution, and they watched their families and friends being picked out, publicly humiliated, and that's always been there in their mind. And as a result, Chinese people have learned to put their head down and not speak their mind.
How has the Chinese Communist Party been able to maintain its grip on power without using the rule of law?
As Anastasia said, it's totally hostile, harmful to the Chinese people, and not in line with Chinese traditions, but it's very much in line with what communism does. Communism, the leadership of the vanguard of the proletariat, and you can see in the Constitution of China, it's all about the leadership of the Communist Party. But this vanguard of the proletariat, it's a few people. So how are a few people going to rule a large number of people without democratic elections? The way they do that is they create fictitious external enemies, and then they mobilize people behind this false creation of an enemy.
So are you saying the party manages to maintain its power by always targeting, basically like a witch hunt, a group that is the enemy?
I mean, originally it was the capitalists, but then the Chinese Communist Party switched to capitalists, and they had to find somebody else. Falun Gong was a good candidate because there was lots of them, they were everywhere. They were not going to defend themselves, and they were not communists, so they became a very easy target.
David, I believe you had a point?
Also, the Tibetan Buddhists have been treated outrageously, and the Dalai Lama, who's probably one of the most admired people in Europe. The Christians have been persecuted.
It's always someone.
The Uyghurs have been persecuted, scapegoated. I think there were 45 atomic bombs set off in the Uyghur part of China.
There is a quality of kind of always digging oneself out of a previous crime. The problem for Jiang Zemin was make Tiananmen go away.
The Tiananmen Square Massacre.
Make Tiananmen Square Massacre go away. Make it disappear. And how do you change the subject? How do you turn the page? Communism is remarkably clever when it comes to tactical moves, okay? So we can often see that. If you've ever dealt with the Chinese Communist Party the way we have and sort of tangled with them, you see them reacting from day to day. But on a strategic level, they're not.
No.
They're quite blockheaded. There you see this attempt to, well, let's just turn the page by creating a new scapegoat, a new group. Let's turn to a new enemy. And that, at least, was the explanation. I'm not sure I completely buy it. I think there's a lot of explanations. I spent a lot of time in my book giving a lot of different possibilities for it. But that is one of the key ones. That is the one he claimed was completely responsible for this. Turn the page, make Tiananmen go away, create a new enemy. Don't let the Public Security Bureau's muscles atrophy. Make sure they stay in shape.
What is the origins of organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience in China?
Well, there's some suspicion about earlier in the 90s, but really 1997 is when you can clearly say it took place. In the Gulje incident, you have 6 high-ranking Chinese cadres arriving in Urumqi, and the doctor, I've interviewed him, he's in Europe, he's told, go to the political prisoner wing in the Urumqi prison, start taking blood samples, map them out, map out who we've got, and well, why do I have to do that? Well, just because we're going to have to start tissue matching these particular people. These guys get their organs, they leave, 6 more come, and this goes on for about a year and a half. These are tiny numbers.
It's clear that something was happening at earlier time.
It went to an industrial scale operation against the Falun Gong community, a peaceful community of 70 to 100 million people targeted by the chairman of the party, and they were killed, as we say, 41,000 transplants by 2006. We can find no other explanation that they were taken from the Falun Gong prisoners of conscience, who had been convicted of nothing, were put into work camps, were blood tested and so on, and then when somebody came from the United States or Canada, they were taken out of a work camp and were killed, and their organ was flown to the buyer in Shanghai usually.
So this was a big shift from the history of the Communist Party persecuting its citizens to the organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners.
Basically, you had prisoners being executed for their organs in the 80s. In the mid-90s, at some point, probably in Xinjiang is where it takes place, you have live organ harvesting. All right, that's when it seems to come in. 1995, 1994, we have Enver Tohti on record. He performs a live surgery. We have other witnesses who are in the same region who describe screams coming out of the organ harvesting vans as if somebody's still alive in there. Then we get the first political prisoners being harvested in 1987, and then in 1999, it all starts to really go into a different world, and that's where we enter the really high levels of organ transplantation.
How do you harmonize this image that the CCP is portraying across the globe of being, a powerful, respectable country with something as terrible as this happening behind the scenes?
The image that we're discussing here of the CCP is not one that is particularly welcome, anywhere when dealing with China.
Well, why isn't it? Just, companies are trying to do business in China.
Right, because they don't want to know about mass killing. There are, states who are trying to deal with China on what, they're trying to get China to help them in some way, like cooperate with them on climate change, for example.
I think the issue is not so much why are they doing that or how are they doing it, is why we outside are not reacting to this better or differently. And I think the reason is there's a lot of willful blindness, that people make money, they've got personal or company or government reasons for wanting to do business with China, and so they just ignore this because it's more convenient to do that.
Anastasia, you had a point?
Yes, because the nature of the crime we're talking about here, the evidence amount to potentially crime against humanity. And because of the nature of the crime, it necessitates a response from foreign government if taken seriously. So everybody is intentionally, perhaps, turning a blind eye on this because no one wants to be the one that's responsible of the moral responsibility to do something, take action.
Not everybody is. The government of Israel and the Knesset in Israel passed laws barring Israeli nationals from going to China for organs when they discovered, a very renowned transplant scientist, Dr. J. Labby, discovered that patients were going to China for transplants at a particular time and place, and he realized then what was happening. So to their great credit, the Knesset passed laws barring trafficked organs. And of course, Taiwan has now done it last year, and Spain has done something quite similar too. So there are 3 countries that have shown real leadership in combating this.
I think one thing the international community fails to realize is the differences in how the Communist Party structures the country versus in the West. For example, in the United States, it's not as if hospitals are answering directly to the US government. But in China, it's a very different situation with how the CCP has a direct hold on all levels of society.
When I was in the Young Pioneer, every single class would have this vice chair of the Young Pioneer and numerous kind of heads or officials, class officials. And those are all commie youth officials. And they start at age 6 or 7. That's how micromanagement this party is. They start with the kids, and every street that they would have a street head, perhaps a middle-aged woman who wears a red band on their arm. Their job is to scrutinize on every neighbor. And this is probably unheard of in the West, but that's the pressure that Chinese people are born into.
This extends very much, to the medical system. Like all these major hospitals, they have party cells. Some of them have websites, so you can see they have party meetings. They have a party secretary in these hospitals. A lot of the surgeons that we've been tracking, they double as party officials. There's one very well-known liver surgeon who's a head of an anti-cult association, specifically to attack Falun Gong. There are doctors who double as the head of a police hospital. The medical system is deeply meshed up with the party.
There's also the structure, which is that for every government function, there's a parallel party function, and the people are different, and the party functionary decides what the government functionary does, rather than the other way around. The government system is a shell or a set of puppets, and it's the party that fills the shell or controls the puppets. I mean, that's one difference with the Western system. Another is there's simply no rule of law. I mean, if somebody in the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party breaks the law, they can be prosecuted. But there's no such thing as prosecuting a Communist Party official who's doing something in a Communist Party function for breaking the law. It's the party that decides what the legal system does, not the legal system deciding whether the law is being respected.
Yeah, to me, it's fairly simple. I mean, this is a surveillance society. Okay, that was my first book, was on basically how surveillance works in China. But that does not mean that everybody is really watched all the time. I mean, yes, there's the women with the red armbands, and there's a certain amount of that going on. But it doesn't mean their sort of electronic surveillance is necessarily taking place of everybody in China. But it does mean party members get watched, and it does mean the military gets watched. And where does organ harvesting begin? It starts in the military hospitals. It was always military hospitals run. And then the armed police get involved, and in fact, it becomes almost competitive between the armed police hospitals and the military hospitals. It is impossible for the Chinese Communist Party not to be watching that activity and blessing that activity. Okay, so right from the beginning, and we haven't even gotten into that topic, but this idea of rogue hospitals and, you know, sort of triad elements, that this sort of idea gets danced out every once a year or so by the Chinese Communist.
Can I just pick up on that military point? One of the cases we discussed in the book, The Bloody Harvest, is a I won't say what country he went with, but he went to a #1 People's Hospital in Shanghai. A Major Tan in uniform came in with a list of names. He went down the list, he picked out a name, came back 2 hours later with a vial with 2 kidneys in it. The kidneys didn't work. He went back 3 more times with 3 more sets of vials of kidneys. None of them worked. He went home to his country, came back about 3 months later, and they went through the same thing again 4 times. So since it was 2 kidneys, every time 4 people were killed before he got his kidney. And
Well, explain why that is such a shocking fact.
That 4 people, undoubtedly some of them were Falun Gong, perhaps most of them were Falun Gong, were killed so that this guy could have a kidney.
So it's impossible to be able to find on short order matching donor organs.
In the West, people wait for organs, and there's long waiting times. With China, it's the reverse. They can get organs almost immediately. It's the sources that are waiting for a patient to show up. With kidneys, and people have 2 kidneys. In theory, you can donate 1 kidney and still survive. But we don't find surviving kidney donors. I mean, more recently, they set up a donor system, and it's possible. But when we were doing our initial reports, it didn't exist. So what we have is a vast organ donor pool, which is being killed when a patient arrives and needs an organ.
There is no way that the Communist Party can deny culpability in this massive system.
They deny it, but then you ask them, well, what is wrong in the book or in any of the books, or in Ethan Gutmann's book, for example, and they have no answer whatsoever. The argument is over, as far as I can tell, and I think there is no serious person that disputes this is going on a massive scale, and we say minimum 60,000 transplants a year are being done in China.
They deny with baffle-gab, gobbledygook, utter nonsense. I mean, they just make up imaginary statements, produce figures without foundation, accuse us all of being anti-China, whatever.
So there is no possibility this is rogue hospitals, as you say, or triads.
I think what's so important about what we have discovered is that you can't do this kind of transplant volume with rogue hospitals. You have to have central involvement across the board.
But with large-scale persecution, like, for example, Falun Gong, it's not just a few people, it has to be the entire society.
And we have a chapter in the book called Sujiatan, and it's about Annie and her husband, who was a surgeon, and in a 2-year period, her husband removed the corneas from the eyes of 2,000 Falun Gong practitioners. He was paid the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of US dollars for doing these operations. He would take the corneas out, and of course they're still alive, and then they'd be unconscious. They'd go into another room, and all their other organs would be taken out. He started to have nightmares and he couldn't do this, and Annie, his wife, told him, you've got to stop this. The two of them managed to leave China, and she blew the whistle on this whole issue. That's the kind of inhuman system that was operating and is operating today in China with the medical profession.
I think if you're asking about how this comes about in terms of motivation, I think there's a number of factors at play. One of them is compartmentalization. People at different parts don't know what the rest is doing, and this helps to make willful blindness function. People will say, well, I don't know, I see a body in the operating table, I don't know whose body it is, or I see a corpse that I'm cremating, I don't know whose corpse I'm creating, and so on. So that's one thing. Another, of course, is censorship, so that none of this is reported. You can't see through the media what's happening. You don't have the normal sources of information. And a third thing is incitement to hatred. I mean, as I mentioned before, the Communist Party is always making up these enemies, but it doesn't just say, designate somebody or some group as an enemy. They start these propaganda campaigns, and that was certainly true with Falun Gong, which depersonalizes, dehumanizes, marginalizes these people to the point where the few people who actually see and know what's going on, they'll say, well, Falun Gong are enemies, Falun Gong are not people, we can do whatever we want with them. And of course, there's the greed factor, all this money that's being poured into it, and the pressure of the party if you break away from them. So this combination, this confluence of events leads to this awful result.
There's a great Nazi comparison. There were probably more than one psychologist, but Robert J. Lifton interviewed a bunch of Nazis in the 50s or 60s, I believe, Nazi doctors. And he observed that in their minds, the difference between healing and killing became blurred. And that's basically how they were able to justify what they did. In this case, it couldn't be any more clear, because they're taking organs out of bad people or non-people and putting them into Chinese citizens and saving lives and stuff. I'm sure that psychology comes in it somewhere, where they can somehow justify killing some people.
Even right in the beginning of this whole process, you have these kinds of questions coming up. I think this has been present from the beginning, but that's an evolution too. I mean, a lot of these doctors got involved in the one-child policy. They did forced abortions. They did them for years. If anything sort of starts that process, forced sterilizations began the Holocaust. It was the same thing. They didn't start by outright killing people and giving them lethal injections, that sort of thing. It was forced sterilizations. It's very similar in China. So you've had this kind of ramping up process within the medical community for many years.
I see the party as an institution that has only one priority, which is keeping the party in power. In power is a group of mass killers. This is the party history, a history of mass murder with the murderers still in power. So it just continues unless something is done to stop it.
I think you raise a very interesting point that the party exists to maintain the party. It's easy for a lot of people to see like a dictatorship and see this one person in power, it benefits him. But with the Communist Party, it's not about preserving the power of any individual. In fact, the history of the party involves many of its top leaders getting purged and killed. It's the system to maintain the system.
It seems that a lot of the debate within China is how to change the Communist Party, how to reform the Communist Party. The obvious solution, which is getting rid of communism, just doesn't seem to be on the table. The party won't let it be on the table. The repression narrows the room for debate, and then within that debate, everybody's talking about how we can improve the Communist Party rather than how we can improve China.
Anastasia, explain about the flag. You might be interested in how the flag is structured.
Flag was 5 stars, the Chinese National People's Republic of China's national flag. The center, big one, means the Communist Party. But if you notice that there are 5 stars, if you take away the big star, if you take away Communist Party, there are 4 stars left. And what is 4 in Chinese?
Death.
Yep. So that's what they make Chinese people think. Without the Communist Party, they're going to die.
Now, I mean, we're just talking about Falun Gong and how it's been maligned, and then switch to the Communist Party. There is a Chinese saying called "zei han zhua zei." It means the thief yells, "Catch the thief." And so the Communist Party called Falun Gong a xie jiao, like a deviant religion, or it was translated to English as an evil cult. And if you actually look at the Communist Party, it's actually a really fun experiment. If you just like look at the attributes of cults, it's like the Communist Party hits every box.
Yes,
takes money from its followers. It keeps people in captivity. It's like
them from their families.
Yeah, it's like
No getting out.
right. It's a centralized thing. Like this is a regime where in the 60s there was cannibalism, like politicalized cannibalism. Like it's not eating because people are starving, like in the Great Leap Forward. This was like eating people's hearts for like because they're political enemies, like documented cases of this. So this is like a really crazy regime.
But China's changed.
So then you bring in the organ harvesting, and like this is like the ultimate. This is the apotheosis of the Chinese Communist movement. It's like cannibalizing their own citizens for money, using doctors.
One of the ways it's changed is it's become a lot more global. It projects its persecution around the world. I mean, there's lots of persecutory regimes, but China is almost unique in the sense that its persecution spreads everywhere.